Welcome to Rewriting the Narrative, an original podcast series produced by the Council for Exceptional Children. I'm Ben Tillotson, 2026 president of CEC. In today's episode, we mark a milestone in education and disability rights, the 50th anniversary of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. Passed in 1975, IDEA guaranteed that students with disabilities have the right to a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. Over the past 5 decades, this landmark legislation has transformed classrooms, expanded opportunities, and shaped the lives of millions of students, families, and educators across the country. To honor this anniversary, I am joined by 2 distinguished experts in the field of special education, Dr. Bill Bogdan and Dr. Luanne Purcell. Together, we'll reflect on the history and impact of IDEA, explore the progress we've made, and discuss the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead as we look toward the next 50 years. So a little introduction on our guests. Dr. Bill Bogdan is a former president of CEC from 1999 to 2000. He began his career as a special education teacher working with students with multiple disabilities, learning differences, and emotional challenges. Over the past 30 years, he has held administrative roles at local, regional, and state levels, ultimately serving as assistant superintendent and chief operating officer of a large regional service center in the Cincinnati area, while also leading a federally funded special education resource center. Bill's work has focused on systems and organizational development, helping schools and districts improve services for students with exceptionalities, gifts, and talents. And if that wasn't enough, Dr. Luanne Purcell recently retired as executive director of the Council of Administrators for Special Education, or CASE, a division of CEC, where she supported school leaders in improving outcomes for students with disabilities. She now consults and serves as a strategic analyst for educational organizations, with experience ranging from teaching general education, gifted, and behavioral support to serving as assistant superintendent in a district of 27,000 students. Dr. Purcell has also taught graduate courses for over 25 years and delivered keynotes in 48 states and 4 countries. So welcome, Bill and Luanne. So to get us started off, tell me, how did you first become involved in special education and what motivated you to stay for this long?
I started out in general education. I taught English and history. My first year, I actually had 3 students who were older than I was. And then my husband and I moved to another district in Middle Georgia, and I taught middle schoolers. And at the end of that year, my principal knocked on the door and said, I just got a call from the central office. We're going to start a class for emotional behavior disorder kids. And since you're the only teacher in the building who's never sent a kid to the office for behavior, I think you should be the teacher. And that's how I got into special education. Not a single class under my belt. I had never taken anything about special education, but just the fact that I would have to go to school made a difference. And I learned everything I needed to know about it by joining our local CEC chapter. And those veteran teachers took care of me.
Wonderful. And what about you, Bill?
So I think about the motivation of what drove me into education. I come from a family of educators, and in high school, I took a human development course, and I had the opportunity to do volunteer work in a preschool classroom that was associated on our high school campus. And I was intrigued by a couple of the children who either were elective non-speakers or by nature of a disability were non-speakers. And that really intrigued me. So I was thinking about, once I left high school, about what programs I would most like to explore. And it was a balance between psychology and education with an emphasis on special education. And so in talking with my parents, my dad, being a consummate educator, said, choose education. You won't regret it, and it'll be a lifelong career. I did. I graduated in 1974 from school in Western Kentucky and had some amazing experiences pre 94-142, which I know we will get into. But I've always felt that this has been a calling. I felt it was a cosmic decision that brought me into education and special education. And I've never had a regret after all these years of serving in teaching and administrative positions.
I think about this statement that you said, Luanne, you talked about how you haven't had a single student that was sent to the principal's office. Why is that? What did you do, and what do you attribute that to in your practice?
Oh, my daddy would tell you that I was born a teacher, but that's another whole story. I really only took education as electives because my daddy said I had to come out of college with something that I could actually do as a job. But I double majored in history and English and then just did a minor in education. But I was thrown into this middle school situation where back in the day, this was 1973, they grouped kids. And so I had 4 classes of regular kids and 1 class of slow learners. And I was teaching Georgia history. The 3rd day, I realized that I was dying in there because these kids couldn't read the textbook. And so they really couldn't do anything. And I rewrote the textbook on about a 2nd or 3rd grade level. And I put the numbers 1 through 55 on the chalkboard. We still had chalkboards back then. And I gave them 3 rules. One rule was that they had to keep their hands to themselves. The second rule was that they had to raise their hand before they talked. And the third rule was they had to have a pencil. And I had a gallon jar on my desk with pencils, so everybody always had at least one rule that they had. And every time anybody in the class broke a rule, I erased the highest number. And then on Friday, whatever that highest number was, that was how long we would listen to records on a record player with a needle. Now, I know people don't even know about those. And so the first Friday, the highest number was 4. And so my husband was a coach. I had his stopwatch, and at 4 minutes, I picked the needle up off the record, and that was it. The next lowest number that we had that entire quarter was 47. And so we maybe didn't have any instruction on Friday, but we had quality instruction Monday through Thursday. And I just, whenever a child was having a problem, I assumed that it was something that I was doing wrong. And so I made a change in my instruction.
That's really interesting, Luanne. I recently presented with a colleague of mine about how do we make or reimagine inclusive environments. And really, the premise of our presentation is before we start blaming the students and expecting these things of them, what are we doing to make those classroom environments more inclusive, more supportive, that they want to be in that place, they want to learn? And so I love that example. And Bill, you talked about just the influence of your family. And I want to touch on this concept of how important are relationships in education and building and sustaining those relationships.
Ben, I would go back to my early days of education. Unlike Luanne, I was fortunate to actually jump feet first into special education. Actually, I was a full special education major with a psych minor with very little training in general education. And so there was a full immersion program that began in 1970 at Western Kentucky University, where I did my undergraduate work. And we spent our first semester in the education program off campus. I had experiences in Nashville and Louisville, primarily in separate facilities and in centers that were strictly restricted to young people and children with disabilities. And so what I learned from that experience really was ground shaking. And so when I actually began my career, it became really critical to understand the nature of families and family support. And my first experience was not in a public school. In Kentucky, there were county comprehensive care centers, and I was hired into one of those as a teacher for students with multiple disabilities and in a segregated facility that was actually within a VFW hall. And I was hired to start a summer program that would continue into a school year. And what was present were 6 wonderful, caring women who had been hired and running a program within this county with no education training, but all the care and all the connections within families. So what they were really providing was that support on a familial basis. I was hired in to create an education program. I was handed a late 60s edition of the Peabody Language Development Kit. That was it. And they said, good luck. We had 21 students aged 3 to 21 with every possible disability. We were in a VFW hall. I showed up the first day. The building was padlocked because it had been raided for a violation of alcohol use the night before. So that started my career. What did I do? I started making home visits. We started congregating with the families. And what I learned as a young educator was the power of culture and the power of families who surround their kids with love. And what I was there to do was to take that forward into an educational environment.
I really love that. Both of your stories tied together in the importance of valuing the individual. And I think that's what we do in special education is we look at that individual first and how are we supporting that individual to be successful in their life, in their community, in their culture. So you both started in education before IDEA came about. How did that begin to shift those perspectives about disability? And maybe Bill, you can start us off.
So after 2 years, I came to Cincinnati, Ohio for a full-time master's program. And while I was doing that, now we were in 1975. So Public Law 94-142 had passed, but the implementation didn't occur until 1977. So after my master's program, I was hired to create a collaborative program between two suburban high schools in the Cincinnati area. It was a resource room, elementary. I had 10 boys. They were identified in the Ohio standards as LD/BD. I laughingly say small L, big B. They were known as Bill's Kids. And we started a classroom with learning centers and integrating as much as we could. The first IEPs were written in 1977. That was an experience. There was no training. There was a piece of paper, and we completed it. So their first real opportunity to develop a relationship with our parents in a systematic way. A lot of stories from that point, but that's how IDEA was introduced to me first year of teaching.
Yeah, so it sounds like they wrote the law and it was great and there's a lot of support for it, but there wasn't really all the research, the instruction, the training, and you guys were there in it, creating that research, doing the foundational work. Luanne, was your experience the same?
Remember, Bill had all that special education, and I didn't have any of that. So I got so much of mine from the local CEC chapter. But IDA made such a big difference in the way we did things. In order to get into special education in my classroom, I just went in and observed a kid. And if I thought they were so far outside of the norm, I said, yeah, we'll take that kid. That literally was how students were placed into my program. And then when they were placed in the program, I took an index card. I sat down with the boy because 70 to, I would say closer to 90% of the students that I had were boys. And I would sit down with them and I'd say, okay, what is it that you need to change in order to be able to be successful in Miss Smith's class? And we would come up with about 5 things that that student, and of course, I would try to tweak it a little bit maybe, that he thought if he changed, he could be more successful in the regular classroom. And so then about every 6 to 8 weeks, we would sit down and take a look at those 5 goals, 5 statements, and see where we were in that whole process. And I'm so old, and even though my district was pretty progressive, in 1977, there was no maternity leave, and I was very pregnant with our first son. And so I actually was on maternity that was not maternity leave. I had to resign. But I had left everything in my classroom ready for my sub to write the IEPs. And she told me later, she said, those index cards had everything on them that I needed to put into the IEP. And so that really validated what I had done. But more than that, it made me realize how important the law was, because I knew from talking with our teachers in our local chapter that they weren't doing those index cards. They were just doing the best they could. And so there wasn't a standardization. There was no one who said you need to look at the present level of performance. You need to look at what the goals need to be in order for the student to be more successful, not just in your class, but in the regular ed classes. And so there was no standardization. And to me, that was one of the big things that IDEA did, 94-142 did. And another thing that was back then was our district had been serving students with disabilities long before 94-142 even was implemented. But we had some rules that were really horrible. One was you couldn't come to school unless you were potty trained. And with 94-142, no, everybody came. If you were 3 years old, you got to come to school no matter what. And so that made some radical differences, and I think they were for the good.
It's really interesting when you think about how is the entire school culture inclusive and accepting that variation, right, in humanity. And sometimes we do have these rules and regulations that are restrictive. I even remember my mom telling me she grew up partly in upstate New York. And back then, if girls did not have socks with their shoes, they had to sit at the back of the class because you had a strict dress code. And kids who didn't have enough money for certain clothing, they always had to sit at the back of the class. And so even if you had a vision impairment or something, the teacher didn't care. You had to sit in the back of the class because those were the rules. And the role of a teacher was to enforce those rules and regulations. And so did you start seeing how IDEA, through your educational career, did you see how it also influenced other practices within school systems, that they started to change where it actually improved things for all students?
After teaching primarily in a learning disabilities program, I entered into administration around 1980. In Ohio, a local control state, at that time, the implementation of the IDEA was primarily left to the local level. So what was happening was the development, all the procedures being done at a local level, not at a state level. That didn't come until years later. So I and a whole group of people were hired into a regional service center at a supervisory level, basically to be assigned out to districts to help them unify the implementation of IDEA and its procedures through the Educational Service Center. But what was also happening then was the development of regionally based programs housed within public schools. So one of my responsibilities was in the identification in Ohio for students with multiple disabilities to create school-based integrated programs, primarily in response to the movement of students out of residential facilities and those kind of institutional settings back into their school system. So in response to your question, what was really necessary was to negotiate for space from a systems level at the regional level into the public schools where the students were entering. What that brought was the level of knowledge and research into the public schools by an entity that was there to create those new kinds of programs. And that was one of my responsibilities to do. I think over time, it became a model for inclusive practices as you were negotiating on behalf of the child and the family into that environment that was individually based on the needs of the child, but also socially based on building community within their neighborhood schools as much as possible. Now, that was a problem because these were regional programs. So you were busing in, and in some cases, you were challenging the receiving system to support children and youth who were not part of their community population. So there was a whole evolution over a 10-year period to really center education back into the neighborhood schools. And I feel blessed that I was able to participate in that process over time.
Mine was totally different from Bill. We had a very strong state department in special education, and our direction did come from them. And that was, I think, directly related to we had a very strong Georgia CEC. And at the Georgia annual CEC conference, the State Department people would come and we would do cracker barrels, and teachers could ask all the big people in the state questions and all. And actually, my very first administrative job came because of the connections I had with those people from the Georgia CEC conferences. But as far as differences, I feel like it's so important for students to be around students who are not just like them. And so I think that when IDEA brought the students into the schools, that it truly did help into the future advocacy because kids grew up with kids who had special needs and they knew that they needed additional support. And one of the best examples of that is that the high school that my youngest son graduated from had a partners club, and they did unified Special Olympics at that school. And my son actually was the president of it his senior year. And he had learned so much because he followed his mama around for 15 years and it was around a lot of people with disabilities, but it truly made a difference. And that principal of that school, when they had the Unified Special Olympics and they had an event in Atlanta or whatever, they did a school-wide, and this was a large school. It had 2,000 students in it. They had a school-wide pep rally to send those students off to Special Olympics. And of course, the students they were sending, half of them were general education students, gifted students. And those special education students had the opportunity, if they participated in a certain number over a certain period of time, they got letter jackets. And so that would have never happened if they'd not been in school with them in middle school and elementary school. It was no big deal when it got to high school. They said, yeah, they're a part of our school. And I think that is really a good example of why it's important for all schools to have students with special needs, whatever it happens to be. Now, I know that sometimes it's really difficult to integrate all your children into every school. Unless you're a small district, you only have one high school, one middle school, one elementary school. But it really does make a big difference, I think. And all that came from Public Law 94-142.
I think what's interesting about this conversation, we're coming from two angles of support specific to an individual school and individual district who are unifying a system that is disparate in that it's a local control state. And you have just in Hamilton County, which is where I serve, we had 23 school districts outside of Cincinnati Public itself. And I'm going to tie this into the Ohio State Department and Ohio CEC. It was in the mid-'80s that I jumped into CEC at the state level. What was happening was the State Department that really was hiring consultants that were specific to discipline areas of special education. And so there was a lot of knowledge base that was coming out of Columbus. And what CEC was able to do, the Ohio CEC, was to navigate its network system based on the structure of Ohio geographically and politically. And so we had chapters all over the states that were professional chapters associated with local colleges and universities. And in Ohio, we also were just beginning the idea of local high school chapters. It was called Project Search, ironic terminology that we know now today. So what we were trying to do was develop a system of recruitment into the profession while advancing the profession itself through the network of support that was created out of 16 regional service centers. One of those I served as executive director, that were federally funded as flow-through monies through the State Department. And so because it was a local control state, CEC, the Ohio CEC, became critically important for training through these resource centers, both the educational resource centers as well as these special ed resource centers, and the network that CEC was naturally creating through its local chapters and its colleges and universities. It was a beautiful network system. And I can only say that the success I had as a teacher and as an administrator rested so strongly with that relationship between CEC and the State Department, similar to the stories that Luanne is sharing in Georgia.
Let's take a quick break to hear about an upcoming event from CEC. Want to level up your practice with the power of AI? Join us for CEC's AI Strategy Summit on January 28th from 11 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern Time, or on your own time after the event. This virtual event is designed for busy educators like you, giving you the latest strategies to save time, boost efficiency, and drive better outcomes for students with exceptionalities. Can't stay all day? No problem. Your registration gives you access to all the recordings so you can watch, rewatch, and learn on your own schedule. Don't miss it. Learn more about the sessions and register today for CEC's AI Strategy Summit. You'll find the link in the podcast description. So, where do you think schools and educators are excelling today in meeting that promise of IDEA for a free and appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment?
I will say that today, as I think about the trajectory of my experience, the beauty of today for me is the nature of this spectrum of understanding around diversity. And it goes well beyond the nature of disability. It's about the diversity of people in general. And to me, what that creates is the opportunity for all to feel they belong into a community, be it at school or within their community. And we've moved from a fairly rigid system of identifying based on a specific discipline or a specific disability to understanding that there's intersectionality that crosses over and brings every nuance that creates the beauty of a person into the complexion of how they are served. And so I see the pyramids of support that we have in place opening the possibility and the potential for all student success as we move through those three tiers of the multi-system. Very different than how we were creating education that was specifically designed for a direct intervention program based on the identification of the disability versus the identification of the gifts and the talents and the uniqueness of the individual that they bring to us today. So I see a lot of progress grading the boundaries and understanding spectrum and understanding diversity in its broadest sense.
I would totally agree with all that Bill just said. I would also say that at the beginning, that we were all having a heart attack over regulations and due process hearings. And I think that we have come a long ways in that area. I think we have better relationships with parents. I think the whole idea of mediation, dispute resolution, leading by convening, I think all of those things have moved us away from that part of special education. But I also think that technology has just exploded and it in many ways has blended the lines of disability because there are so many things that you can do with that technology that brings those kids up on a clearer line of equity. And I think that's been very helpful. There's a lot of things going on that I think are not helpful. I think that we have not been successful in promoting teaching as a positive profession. And I think that we have not supported teachers as much as we could and provided the encouragement. And we find ourselves right now in such a shortage that's impacting everyone. And then I also feel that one of the biggest dangers or one of the things that I think is promoting us stepping backwards is the promotion of public funds to private schools. Again, what I said earlier about what a gift it is for students to be in a setting where they have peers who are not just like them, the diversity, the disability. And we don't have enough money as it is for public schools. And if you take some of that money away, then what's going to be left in the public schools? And the more diverse our schools are, the better educated all children are and the better the resources are applied. And so I worry about that. But I do think that we can move forward. We just need to remember where we've been and not try to go back there. 'Cause it is better now than it was.
The piece I would add to that is understanding the person most engaged with the students, our teachers, are the ones who need our support. And this is where I believe that CEC, as its evolution back to the local level and its relationships with state departments through its state units and the provincial units and the ministry system of Canada, can follow the teacher. And that teacher may be in a charter school. That teacher may be supporting students whose parents have accepted voucher monies within the private system. And so how do we navigate getting to the person providing the service to the family and to the child in a politically volatile time? And I think that's part of the challenge that Luanne is referring to with recruitment and retention issues of keeping people and supporting them. And I think of the network that CEC has always been providing and what we can do to continue that support to the individual.
I really feel that when CEC was able to support teachers the most was when we had the local chapters, when we had strong local chapters. And we're working on doing that. I'm doing a session at International Case on how to build local chapters because I know the support I got as a teacher from the other teachers and the veteran teachers. And I know that when those veteran teachers did something to help me, it made them feel good too. I also know that I got more leadership skills from what I had to do in that local chapter than I did when I got my doctorate at the University of Georgia. And so it's really a pipeline of training leaders. And the local chapter leaders then can become the state unit or provincial unit leaders. But we always know that the support needs to be at the lowest level. And at that school building, in that district, in that region, that's where we're going to meet those teachers. And CEC has so many resources now they didn't have back then. And with the webinars and with all the things that we can pull. And I was just talking to a chapter the other day, a brand new chapter in Marietta City, and giving them suggestions. And I said, you guys have access to the CEC webinars, do that for a meeting and take the teaching exceptional child and take one article and talk about that. Nobody has time to read all that stuff, but one person can read it and then talk about it, and then that will encourage others to read the others. There's so many resources CEC has now, and we just need to have a conduit, and that local chapter, I believe, is the conduit.
What I love about this conversation is I keep thinking about the questions I'm going to ask, and you both just answer the questions. And I could just listen to you both talk because you're answering those questions and you're really highlighting how CEC truly has been an integral part of special education that I don't think a lot of the general public know how CEC was integral in the passing of IDEA and in educating professional special educators, in supporting families, helping to advocate for them. So thank you both so much for everything you guys are saying. And I think when you speak about the students that we serve, I believe IDEA supports over 7.9 million children in the United States. And it is crucial that we know how those funds are being used, that they do stay with those students and the services so that they can get that quality education. I know recently, even though we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of IDEA, we have a glide past some momentum moving towards this reauthorization or continuing to support the funding for that because Congress has yet to fulfill their statement of fully funding IDEA. And so we know that school systems continue, to what you pointed out, Luanne, we continue to get underfunded for education and especially special education. And that need is continually growing. So you both talked about kind of these challenges that we face within special education. And if you were to speak to someone who is not in special education, they don't have a child with a disability, they are not a special educator, but just someone in the general public, what would you want them to know about IDEA legislation and or how important it is that we support individuals with disabilities?
So when I think of community in the broadest sense of the definition of community, I go back to my comments related to diversity. And there's always this story about at any moment, any one of us could become disabled just by the nature of what happens within our lives. And the awareness of that eventuality occurring at any point in our lives becomes important as a conversation starter. I think also it's important to help people recognize and realize that wherever they are in community, they are among people who are diverse by the nature of their skin color, by the nature of their language, by the nature of their gender, by the nature of their abilities and disabilities. And so this is just one more of those complexions around who we are as a human community. And it comes to me, where do you want to belong? And what do we all have a responsibility to do to create the most open, welcoming community so that everyone who enters into that community belongs, be it within a school environment, be it within a place of worship, be it in a recreational environment. For example, the Ohio State Fair has a Tuesday morning low sensory day so that people with disabilities may experience without all of the trauma that comes with the sounds and the lights within a fair environment. And so the movement is towards bringing all community entities together around the table and solving those issues together. Education is only one part of that. For me, it's about belonging, it's about community, and it's about finding the best that can give the best to all of our community members.
I totally agree with that. And I think of a TV show a couple of years ago called Speechless. It featured a young boy who had CP, and the mother was fighting for ramps into the school. And she said, it won't just benefit my son, it'll benefit all those teachers that are carrying those crates on little trucks. It help everybody. And then I think that's true. But what I would say to someone about that knows nothing about special education, I would say that it has worked. Sure, we can do better, but if it were to go to a block grant instead of specifically for IDEA, we're human and our nature is not to do the right thing all the time. If we would have done the right thing, we wouldn't have had to have a federal law. And I'm just telling you, there are communities where if you just gave them a certain amount of money, a new gymnasium or a parking lot would be paved because the whole community doesn't have the experience of a student who has a disability and what their needs are. And I don't have all the experience. I thought I did until 5 years ago. My son, who was the Special Olympics Volunteer Youth of the Year, had a trisomy 13 child. And Samuel is almost 6 years old, and he functions as a 3-month-old. And while I thought I understood all of that, I truly didn't understand what it did to the family. And so nobody can understand and make all the right decisions as an individual. And that's why we have to have special interest groups. That's why we have to have someone looking out for folks who don't have a voice. And CEC is that voice, and IDEA is a law that they worked hard for, and we have to preserve it if we want to maintain the advantages and the great strides that we've made over these last 50 years.
Thank you both. I think that's very powerful and impactful. There's so many parts of our community that we don't understand. Recently spoke to a group of students in a course at a university. It was a multidisciplinary course, and it was how do you design for human factors? And I spoke about if you don't have the voice of the people that you're designing the product, the building for, then you're always going to fall short of designing something that actually is going to be meaningful and effective and functional for those individuals. And so do as much research and investigation as you can. And so I'd encourage everybody to, when there is a law or something being passed that may impact a certain group, do some research. Ask those individuals, how is this going to impact you? Find someone with a disability or a parent who has a child with a disability and ask them, how is your life impacted by these things? I think there's so many parts of my own community that I'm just not aware of because I'm so busy with my own life. And it is true that the more that we create those spaces and we listen to those individuals and their perspectives, the better communities we can create. To your story, Luanne, where it's not just going to benefit one person, it's probably going to benefit a lot of people. And so I guess a final question is, what gives you hope? When you think about the future of special education, where is that hope?
So CEC celebrated its 100th anniversary a couple of years ago. We're at 103, I think. And the theme of the convention that year was a community of kindred spirits. And so when I think about always challenging others to think beyond themselves and to think about the other, And when I use the other, I know how loaded that is because we have a tendency as a human being species to categorize people as the other. And it draws all kinds of negatives into the recognition of those people in ways that aren't always positive. And so what gives me hope is that we define community in the best way. And in defining that community, we are giving of ourselves so that we are making the lives of others better. And my hope is that the community of kindred spirits continues to grow as we saw it with 4,000 people in a hall in the 100th anniversary of CEC in Orlando.
I would say that I know it's a trite saying, but we are so much better together. And so my hope is in the local chapter. I would not be who I am today if it were not for CEC and specifically for that local chapter. And by meeting the needs of those teachers at the local level, then we're building a legacy. And that's what we have to always maintain is that we're not always going to be here, but there'll always be somebody behind us. And we just need to recognize that we're better together. And that means everybody. And a good way of getting that group together is through the local chapter.
Thank you. I love that. Some people will often say, oh, you're in special education, and then they shower you with all these compliments. But I always hate that phraseology because it also implies that only a certain type of people would work in this field. And maybe that's true. Not everything is for everyone, right? But honestly, I feel like working in special education has been my greatest education as a human being. And it has helped me to be better at creating community within my social groups. There's many times where people comment on things I do that making modifications, adaptations, that to me, they just come natural because of my professional experience. And so realizing that because as special educators, we have opened ourselves to want to supporting the individual, being willing to adjust, being willing to be flexible. And I think there's so much to be gained from that. And to your point about how are we elevating this field of education, I think it's realizing the power and the influence that we have as special educators, not just within the field of special education, but within our communities, within our local chapters, the impact that we can have just by being who we are, by the skills that we have gained through our profession that have taught us these things. And so to finally end this episode, thank you both so much. This has been so valuable to reflect on where we've come within CEC and with IDEA legislation. Could you have imagined that here we are with 33,000 members worldwide? It's incredible. So part of that journey, though, is our own education. So I want to ask you, Luanne and Bill, who's an educator in your lives that you can think of that had a positive impact?
I tell this story a lot. When I started school, I was only 5 years old and I was placed in a classroom. And the teacher didn't believe that I could be called by my name. I had to be called by my birth certificate first name, which was Sally. And she also didn't believe the doctor when he said that I couldn't drink milk. And so she was horrible. I developed school phobia, and my mother went up to the school, threatened to burn it down. Bottom line was, I got moved into Miss Clack's classroom. And Miss Clack was the most amazing person in the whole world. And I believe fully that one teacher is the reason I am 73 years old today. I don't believe I would have lived. I think that teacher would have crushed me. And instead, the other teacher lifted me up and helped me become a true learner who thirsted after all knowledge.
That's so wonderful. What about you, Bill?
It's interesting. I immediately think of my kindergarten teacher also. And the first day of school, my mother walked us to school and she introduced me to the kindergarten teacher. And the room was set up as a typical kindergarten class. And the teacher said, go find something you want to do and welcome to the class. This is so funny. Left were all the little boys playing with their trucks, and to the right were the girls playing in the kitchen. So I went right, And I started playing with the girls in the kitchen. And it was interesting. My mother just smiled. And the teacher said, "It's okay. That's fine." And I remember that now. That little gesture didn't direct me into what society thought I should do and be. And I celebrate that today. For me, it's always about systems. It isn't the child, it isn't the teacher, it's the system. And how do we improve systems so that everyone can be successful? And that to me was my first day in kindergarten.
Thank you so much for sharing those wonderful stories. And thanks again for joining us today, Bill and Luanne. And thanks to everyone for listening today to Rewriting the Narrative as we commemorate the 50th anniversary of this landmark legislation. Join us each month as we continue our conversation with key voices in the world of special education. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. And for more information on the Council for Exceptional Children, visit us online at exceptionalchildren.org. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.